So most of us do not have identical twins. And so we probably wonder what it'd be like to actually have someone that's exactly like you, that looks exactly like you. Um, Obviously, if you have an identical twin, you know how it is. You know if you actually like the same things, if you actually do the same things, behave the same way, you would know the answer to that question. But if you don't have an identical twin, then you wonder these things, right? And so many examples exist out there, like Dude Perfect, Despicable Me, Harry Potter. We have seen so many examples of identical twins. And what does it actually mean to be an identical twin? What it pretty much is you're obviously brothers or sisters, and the only difference is that you have the exact same DNA. Instead of having similar DNA, because you still come from the same parents, and they obviously have this very similar variations in DNA that they contribute to making you. So instead of having similar DNA, you have the exact same DNA. Now, you might ask, why do some identical twins look slightly different? So the reason why, obviously, you're not exactly the same, you don't behave exactly the same and all those things, that's because of your environment. So, right, not only your genetics contribute to who you are, the people you surround yourself with, the environment you grow up in, all of these things contribute to you being slightly different from the other twin. But what's definitely true is that you have the exact same DNA. So, for example, let's say he looks a bit bigger than his brother. So the only reason for that is because of the environment. He might inherently like to gym or do sports more than the other one, or something like that. So your environment plays a big role. Now, all of these examples that I mentioned here, these are natural clones. They were born from the same parent with the same DNA at the same time. So they're clones, but they're exact same age, right? Now you might be wondering, if you don't have a twin right now, so you have brothers or sisters, but obviously they're younger or older. So you're wondering, is it possible for me today, if I was a scientist, to create my own clone that will one day end up looking the way I did? Let me explain a story that will tell you why this is possible or why this is not possible. Now, there's a story. I don't know if you've heard of it, but the story involves Dolly the Sheep. So they just call it Dolly the Sheep story. Now so what you're basically questioning is whether or not it is possible to create a clone unnaturally, because all of these were natural. They were born by accident, basically. Now, is it possible to make one on purpose? Now, so this is the story, but obviously I'm using Shaun the Sheep from the movie Shaun the Sheep, but we're going to pretend the name is Dolly instead of Shaun, okay? Just because it's more interesting. Now here, if you wanted to know, this is how the real Dolly looks, okay? The real version, but we're using Shaun the Sheep. So before I explain how the clone was made, or how they tried to make the clone from that Shaun the Sheep or Dolly the Sheep, I gotta explain how Dolly was made in the first place. So Dolly, or Shaun, had parents, right? Now these parents one is mom, one is dad, and we all know this process, but I'm just going to quickly go over it because you need to understand some key things for it to make sense. So the dad, obviously, we all know, donates sperm, okay, and the mom donates eggs. Now, what are these cells? What is unique about these cells? Why can't you just use normal body cells? Now, what's unique about these cells is that they are called gametes, sex cells. Now, what does that mean, you might ask? So gametes are basically the same as your body cells, except they have half the amount of DNA. So this sperm right here would have 23 chromosomes instead of 46 chromosomes, like all your other body cells. Now your mom's might have, the egg cell might have 23 chromosomes as well. So they basically gametes have half the amount of DNA as a normal body cell. Okay, so there's two names, gametes or sex cells. And you might be like, so why the hell do you need half the amount of DNA? Why don't you want the full amount of DNA to be donated? Well, if you donated double your body cell's DNA, then your kid would end up having double the amount of DNA than they should. So that's why your parents donate sex cells, which are only, so if for example, these are only in the testes. Your sperm cells are only in the testes. All of the other cells in your body are autosomes or somatic cells, body cells. Okay, and they have 46 chromosomes. So these sex cells are donated, and when they come together through fertilization, so for example, when they reproduce, the sperm will meet the egg, and 23 plus 23, when it donates its DNA, it will come together, and now basically you'll have 46 chromosomes, right? You'll have 46. And now that's perfect, because a normal human, all their body cells or all their autosomes, somatic cells, have 46 chromosomes. So that's perfect. That's why they give half-half, right? So at the end of the day, when the sperm and the egg meet, we have what you call a zygote. A zygote is the immediate product of an egg and a sperm meeting. Okay, so a cell that has 46 chromosomes. But what's unique about this cell compared to a normal body cell, just pay attention. It might be difficult to grasp at first, but it's super important. So what's unique about this cell compared to just a normal body cell? What's unique about this cell is that this cell has the ability to differentiate. So this cell is so unique because it can become absolutely anything. All your body cells are already differentiated. They've already become what they wanted to become. Your skin cells became skin cells. This cell may have become a muscle cell, a nerve cell, all of these different cells. For example, this cell or this cell. Now, so basically when they meet, now it's a zygote, now it's going to divide. So you have many cells, okay? So when you have now many cells, all of these cells will eventually become their specialized, their destiny. They're going to become what they need to become. So they can become, like I said, a nerve cell, a muscle cell, a skin cell, anything. Now, eventually, when they all become what they want to become, you're going to have the organism. So in this case, we have Dolly the sheep. So that's how Dolly the sheep was made. So grasp this concept of being special, having the ability to differentiate, having the ability to specialize. Because what's important is, once these cells specialize, so once this cell becomes a nerve cell, it cannot reverse. Once this cell becomes a muscle cell, it cannot reverse, okay? So that's very important, because that means when you're an organism and your body cell, so say you take a muscle cell, you cannot undo that process. You can't make that muscle cell back into this undifferentiated cell, this cell that can become anything. So you can't change the course of that cell, at least today. Maybe in the future when science develops, but today that's not possible yet. So bear this concept in mind, because that's going to become important in how a clone is made. So now this Dolly, when he grows up, he thinks to himself, I want to make my clone, because I don't have an identical twin. So I'm like, I love myself, and I want to make some more of me so I can do things with myself, and actually, because no one else wants to play with me, right? So he wants to make himself. So and that's what he's going to do. But it's quite difficult because of what I just explained. All his cells are already differentiated. He can't change their course. So when he takes his body cells and tries to make his clone, they don't want to do anything because they're already old. They're already differentiated. They can't become a new organism. So he has to go and ask his scientist friends, and they're going to tell him how it works. So this is the process. Here we go. So Dolly the sheep asked his scientist friends, and they told him all he's got to do is take one of his body cells. So this is a body cell. I'll label it here. It's an autosome. So these are more names that you should know, just because they use them randomly. So this is a body cell, autosome, or somatic cell. They're all the same thing. And remember, like I said, an autosome has 46 chromosomes. Okay, 46. So this is all the DNA you need. Now, they told him to take one of his body cells and take him to a lab. And what they will do is remove the nucleus. So that's what they do. They remove the nucleus from that cell. Because if he wants to create a clone exactly alike to him, that clone needs to have the exact same DNA, right? The exact same DNA, because that's what identical twins are, as I mentioned before. They have the exact same DNA. They're genetically identical. And so the scientist told him, if you want your clone, you gotta make sure your clone has the exact same DNA. So that's what he does. He takes his body cell, one of his body cells, and he takes out the DNA. Okay, now great. Now the problem is, you might ask, okay, so why didn't he just leave it in his normal cell and make that cell become a clone? The problem with that is, like I just mentioned, this cell is already differentiated. It's already become what it was meant to become. So you can't undo this process. You can't make this cell turn into anything else anymore. It's done. So what is important is he needs to put his DNA into a cell that can still become anything, a cell that is undifferentiated. So basically, he wants to make sure his DNA comes into this cell, an egg cell that has the ability to become anything. So that's what he does. He goes and asks his friend, "Oh man, I want to create my clone, but I don't have an egg cell." So what I do is he asks this friend to donate an egg cell, because an egg cell, like I said, can become anything still. So his friend donates the egg cell, but obviously he can't just put his DNA into there because there's already DNA. So he asks his friend to remove that DNA, and that's what the friend does. It removes the DNA. So now it's empty. It's still a cell, and remember, the difference between these two cells is that this one can become absolutely anything. It can become an entire organism. And the one thing that will tell this cell what to become is the DNA inside it. The DNA, remember, is like the instructions. It basically orders your cell to become a specific thing. But we don't want this one's DNA. We don't want this sheep's DNA, because this sheep's DNA is going to make sure that this cell becomes this sheep, right? So we want Dolly the Sheep's DNA in there to make sure that this cell becomes exactly the same thing as Dolly the Sheep. So they decide to put Dolly the Sheep's DNA into this egg cell and let it replicate to become many. And that's what happens. They make many cells. Remember, all of this is taking place in a lab, so it's not inside of this sheep yet, because they decided to remove the egg cell so that they can put his nucleus in there, and they can't do that while being inside the body, so they removed all of the cells. So right now this is taking place in like a petri dish or a science lab. Now they wait for it to replicate a bit, and then what they do is they take these cells that are undifferentiated, so they can still become anything, and they put it back into the sheep, because this sheep will basically give birth to it. But remember, the baby that this sheep will give birth to will be 100% identical to Dolly the Sheep. Nothing at all related to this one, because this one's nucleus was removed. Remember? So the DNA is only from this one. So this one will kind of give birth to the baby, but it will be nothing to do with this. It will be in no way identical or alike to this mom. So when they put it back, eventually the baby grows and she gives birth to something that is exactly like Dolly the Sheep. So isn't that crazy interesting? So you can legit make a clone in reality if you follow this process. Now you might be wondering, now why has no one in this world made an identical human yet? Well, the reason to that is largely based on ethics, right? But before we get into that, I need to say something. So interestingly enough, Dolly the Sheep's clone ended up only living 6 years. Now, you might be wondering, why does that matter? Well, Dolly the Sheep, actually, a normal sheep becomes 12 years old. So that's half the lifespan. And interestingly enough, when they replicated this experiment with pigs and cows and things like that, it ended up being the same. The clone only lived around half the lifetime. So they're not sure why that is. Some people say that it's because this clone was born already 6 years old, just like the original Dolly, because the DNA was taken from a 6-year-old sheep, put in there, and now it's going to be born 6-year-old. That's some theories. There's many theories, but there's also other theories that believe that when you make a clone, it's going to be more susceptible to diseases and things like that, and therefore die earlier. So there's no fixed answer yet. But basically, one of the big problems is that all the clones are apparently dying much earlier. So that's one of the major issues. By the way, this technique is called somatic cell nuclear transfer. You need to know this name. It's not complicated. So somatic cell, this is a somatic cell. It's a body cell. Nuclear transfer. So they transfer the nucleus from a somatic cell. Like I said, they took away this nucleus from the somatic cell and they transferred it into an undifferentiated cell that can become exactly what that DNA it tells it to become, right? Which is the exact same as the original sheep. Now the ethics, going back to this. So in theory, even if it were to work perfectly, and this sheep would live exactly the same lifetime, the issue with this is that having, for example, having a farm, so the only reason why you would do this in the first place, the advantage of doing this, is because say you have a farm and one of your sheep are especially good. So if you compare these two, say for some reason Dolly makes much better quality wool, and the farmer wants to clone the sheep because then he'd have so much good wool. So then they do that, and they clone it, and they make so many of the same sheep that have this wool. In theory, that's great because now they can sell so much better quality wool. But the problem with this is, since they're genetically identical, if some disease arises that affects this specific sheep, it will basically affect all of the sheep because there's no diversity. There's absolutely no diversity, because if you were to have a farm with genetically different sheep, if a disease were to arise, it may only affect some of the sheep. But in this case, it would affect absolutely all of them. But anyways, on top of that, we all know they only live 6 years, or they live half the lifespan. So in theory, it's actually going to cost more money to do this than money that you would make out of it, because your sheep would die far earlier than they should. Okay, I hope all of this is making sense so far. We got one more thing that's pretty important. So let's get back to that. So, as I mentioned before, identical twins are ways of natural cloning. So in the world of agriculture, that also happens. It's actually really interesting. So here we have a strawberry plant, okay, on the left, this image. And you can see it gives out these kind of pole-like things. These pole-like things are actually coming from the original plant. And when they're called like shoots, okay? So when they come, they give out these suckers or stems, and these stems are gonna extend out to another area on the ground. And since it's coming from the original plant, it's gonna grow and it's gonna be the exact same plant. Basically, it's gonna look like a different plant because it's on a different area, but it's actually the exact same plant. So this is a way of natural cloning. Now, more interestingly, it happens also on English elm trees. So if you look out onto a field of English elm trees, you might think all those trees are completely different. They're different trees. But unlike these strawberry plants that extend their suckers on top of the floor, these do beneath the floor. So you actually can't see that they're related. So all the trees you might see might actually be genetically identical. They might actually be clones. They might actually be the exact same tree. As you can see on this image, they extend these suckers and they actually form many trees that might perceive from the outside like different trees, but they might actually be the exact same tree, and that's a clone because they have the same exact genetics. So just understand that for this whole cloning topic, there's natural cloning and unnatural cloning. Dolly the sheep, the story I explained, was an example of unnatural cloning, and I hope you see that there's many problems with that currently, and that's why they haven't actually done that with any humans. Due to ethics. There's many arguments that can be made here. You can research that. And I hope you understand the process. So just know natural and unnatural cloning. That's basically what this topic is about. And make sure you know the processes.